The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, and I knew before opening it that my life was about to get complicated. My name is Carter Kellerman, and 3 months earlier, my grandfather had passed away, leaving me his mountain cabin in Pine Ridge, Colorado. The place sat on 2 acres of pristine land, with views of the Rockies that could make your heart stop. I had spent every summer there as a kid, learning to fish in the creek that ran through the property, helping Grandpa patch the roof, listening to his stories about how his own father had built the cabin back in 1947 with timber from the surrounding forest. When the lawyer told me I had inherited it, I cried for an hour straight. Now, standing in my Denver apartment with this letter in my hands, I felt my stomach drop. The Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, through their president Sharon Whitmore, was formally notifying me that my property had been deemed a public nuisance and safety hazard. I had 30 days to bring it up to code or face condemnation proceedings. I read it 3 times, my anger building with each pass. The cabin was old, sure, but Grandpa had maintained it lovingly for decades. I had been up there just 2 weeks ago, starting to sort through his belongings, and while it needed some work, it was hardly a hazard. The letter listed violations I had never heard of, regulations about siding materials, roof pitch angles, and setback requirements that seemed designed specifically to target older properties. I grabbed my phone and called my best friend Marcus, who worked in real estate law. "They cannot do this," I said the moment he picked up. "Can they do this?" "Whoa, slow down. Who cannot do what?" I explained the situation, reading portions of the letter aloud. Marcus listened quietly, which was never a good sign. He was usually quick with reassurances. "Carter, when did Pine Ridge incorporate an HOA?" he finally asked. "I have no idea. Grandpa never mentioned one." "That is your first problem. If the HOA was established after your grandfather purchased the property, there should have been a vote, a process. He might not have even been required to join. But if he did join, or if it was mandatory, you inherited those obligations along with the property. So they can just kick me out, not exactly, but they can make your life difficult. Look, send me everything you have. I will review it tonight and call you tomorrow." I spent the rest of the day in a fog, barely able to concentrate at my job as a graphic designer. All I could think about was that cabin, the way morning light filtered through the pines, the sound of the creek, my grandfather's weathered hands showing me how to properly stack firewood. I was not going to lose it without a fight. That weekend, I drove up to Pine Ridge, a scenic 2-hour journey that usually calmed my nerves. Not today. The town itself was small, maybe 1,500 residents, with a main street lined with shops catering to tourists heading up to the ski resorts. The cabin sat on the outskirts, where the development thinned out and gave way to national forest land. As I pulled onto the dirt road leading to the property, I noticed something new. A large sign proclaimed this the Pine Ridge Historic District, with rules about exterior modifications, paint colors, and architectural styles listed below. My blood pressure spiked. This sign definitely had not been here a few months ago. The cabin looked the same as I had left it, a sturdy 2-story structure with a wide front porch and stone chimney. The wood siding had weathered to a silvery gray that I had always found beautiful, though I could see now how someone might call it worn. A few shutters hung slightly crooked. The roof was original cedar shake, some pieces cracked or missing. I was walking around the property, taking photos and notes when I heard a car pull up. A silver Lexus SUV parked next to my truck, and a woman in her late 40s emerged. She wore expensive athletic wear and oversized sunglasses, her blonde hair pulled into a severe ponytail. "You must be Carter Kellerman," she said, not offering her hand. "I am Sharon Whitmore, HOA president. I got your letter. Then you understand the situation. This property is a blight on our community. It drives down property values and violates multiple covenants." I forced myself to stay calm. My grandfather owned this cabin for 50 years. It was here long before most of the houses in this area, which is exactly the problem. Pine Ridge has grown and improved. We have standards now. Your grandfather, rest his soul, was given multiple opportunities to comply, but he refused to engage with the HOA. Because he probably thought it was ridiculous. This cabin is part of this area's history. Sharon smiled, but there was no warmth in it. History does not exempt you from present-day responsibilities. The condemnation hearing is scheduled for April 15th. I suggest you use the time wisely. She drove off before I could respond, leaving me standing there furious and helpless. Inside the cabin, I started going through Grandpa's files more carefully. He had been meticulous about record keeping, and I found deeds, tax records, and maintenance receipts going back decades. What I did not find was anything about an HOA. Then, in a folder labeled Nonsense 2024, I hit pay dirt. Letters from Sharon, notices about HOA formation meetings, demands for dues, and Grandpa's responses, typed on his old typewriter, politely but firmly declining to participate. In one letter from last June, he wrote that his property predated any such organization, and that he had never agreed to join. Sharon's response was icy, stating that state law required all properties within designated boundaries to comply with HOA regulations once properly established. My phone rang. "Marcus, I have good news and bad news," he said. "The bad news is the HOA was legally formed 2 years ago with proper notice and state approval. Your grandfather's property falls within the boundaries. And the good news is they are overreaching badly. Colorado law has specific protections for properties that predate HOA formation, especially if the owner never signed the covenants. Your grandfather bought that land in 1974. He has documentation. The HOA can attempt condemnation, but they have to prove actual safety hazards, not just aesthetic complaints. So what do I do? 2 things. First, hire a local attorney who specializes in property law. Second, and this is important, Carter, you need to get out ahead of this. Do not just defend. Find an angle that puts them on the back foot." I spent that night in the cabin, sitting by the fireplace, thinking. The logs Grandpa had cut were still stacked by the hearth. I could almost hear his voice, telling me stories about the old days, about resilience and standing your ground. That is when I remembered the logbook. Grandpa had kept detailed journals, documenting everything about the cabin's construction and history. I found them in a trunk in the loft, leather-bound books filled with his cramped handwriting and tucked in photographs. The earliest entry was from his father, my great-grandfather, dated April 1947. "Broke ground today on what will be our family's refuge. War is over, but its shadows remain. Here, we will build something lasting." I read through the night, watching the story of the cabin unfold. The original construction, done by hand with help from neighbors. The addition of the second story in 1962. The stone work on the chimney, completed by a local mason who had learned his trade in Italy. Repairs after the big storm of 1984. Every nail, every board, documented and dated. And then I found the photographs. Black and white images of Pine Ridge from the 1940s and 50s, when it was barely a settlement. The cabin appearing in the background of several shots, one of the few structures visible. More photos from the 60s and 70s, showing the cabin as a landmark, with handwritten notes on the back identifying it as the old Kellerman place. An idea formed, audacious and risky but possibly brilliant. Monday morning I called in sick to work. I had research to do. The Pine Ridge Historical Society operated out of a small building on Main Street, run by a woman named Dorothy Chen who had to be in her 70s. She wore thick glasses and a cardigan despite the spring warmth, and she lit up when I explained why I was there. The Kellerman cabin. Of course I know it. One of the original homesteads in this area. Your great-grandfather was quite the craftsman. Do you have any records about it? Oh, I am sure we do. Let me look. She disappeared into the back room, and I heard the sound of file cabinets opening and closing. 20 minutes later, she returned with an armful of folders and books. Here we are. See, the cabin appears in this survey from 1952, and here is a mention in the county records from 1959. Oh, and this is wonderful. Look at this article from 1976. She showed me a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Pine Ridge Gazette. It was a feature about historic properties in the area, and the cabin was prominently mentioned, with a photo of my grandfather standing on the porch. The Kellerman cabin represents the pioneer spirit that built this community, the article read. Constructed with traditional methods and local materials, it stands as a testament to craftsmanship that is increasingly rare in our modern age. Can I make copies of all this? I asked. You can do better than that, dear. You can borrow the originals. We trust you. Armed with this documentation, I drove to Boulder to meet with the attorney Marcus had recommended, a sharp woman named Patricia Frost who had handled several HOA disputes. Her office was modern and efficient, and she listened to my story without interrupting. This is excellent material, she said, flipping through the documents. But if you really want to stop the HOA, we need to go on a fence. That is what my friend said. I have an idea, but I do not know if it is feasible. Tell me. What if we get the cabin designated as a historic landmark? If it has protected status, the HOA cannot touch it, right? Patricia leaned back in her chair, a smile spreading across her face. That is exactly the right approach. Colorado has robust historic preservation laws. If your property is listed on the state register, it gets significant protections. The HOA would have to prove demolition is the only option, which with this documentation, they cannot do. How do we make that happen? We apply to the Colorado Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. It is a process, but with what you have here, you have a strong case. The property is over 75 years old. It has documented historical significance. It represents a distinct period and construction method. The challenge is timing. These applications can take months. The hearing is in 3 weeks. Then we file for an emergency stay, citing pending historic designation application. We argue that the HOA cannot condemn a potentially historic property without allowing the evaluation process to complete. I can draft that today. I left her office feeling hopeful for the first time since that letter arrived. We had a plan. More than that, we had the truth on our side. This cabin was not a blight. It was a piece of living history. The next 2 weeks were a blur of activity. Patricia filed the emergency stay, which the county judge granted, pushing the hearing back to May 20th. I submitted the historic designation application with every piece of documentation I could gather. Dorothy from the Historical Society wrote a letter of support. I tracked down old neighbors who remembered the cabin from decades ago and got their statements. I also started the actual restoration work. If we were going to argue the cabin was historically significant, it needed to look the part. I took vacation time from work and moved into the cabin temporarily, spending dawn to dusk repairing and restoring. The first priority was the roof. I found a supplier who still manufactured cedar shakes using traditional methods, expensive but authentic. I hired a local contractor, Tom Bradshaw, who had experience with historic properties. He was in his 60s, with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude. "This is good construction," he said, examining the roof frame. "They do not build them like this anymore. See how these joints fit. No nails, just precise cuts and wooden pegs. Your great-grandfather knew what he was doing. Can we save it? We can do better than save it. We can restore it to exactly how it was. I have photos from the Historical Society. We will match everything." Working with Tom was educational. He explained how the original builders had used local timber, cutting and treating it on site. How the stone for the chimney had been gathered from the creek bed. How the windows, now old and drafty, were actually custom made by a craftsman in Denver who had since passed away, but whose grandson still operated the business. "If you are serious about historic designation, we need to do this right," Tom said. "That means period-appropriate materials and methods. It will not be cheap. I do not care about the cost. I care about preserving what my family built." Sharon Whitmore drove by at least once a day, slowing down to glare at the work in progress. I ignored her. Let her watch us restore this place to its former glory. 3 weeks into the restoration, I got a visit from the county building inspector, a nervous young man named Kevin who looked fresh out of college. "I need to see your permits," he said apologetically, "for restoration work on a potentially historic property." I did not think I needed permits for like repairs. "Mrs. Whitmore filed a complaint. She says you are doing unpermitted construction." Tom, who had been working on the porch, climbed down from his ladder. "Son, I have been doing this for 40 years. We are not doing construction. We are doing restoration, matching original materials and methods. That is exempt under state preservation law." Kevin looked uncertain. "I still need to file a report. Then report that we are in full compliance," Tom said firmly. "And tell Sharon Whitmore that harassment of property owners is actionable." After Kevin left, Tom shook his head. "That woman is a piece of work. She has been trying to run people out of this area for years, wants to replace all the old cabins with McMansions. More property tax revenue for the county, more prestige for the HOA. Has she succeeded? Twice that I know of. Elderly owners who could not afford to fight her. She got their properties condemned, they sold for nothing, developers bought cheap and built big. It is a racket." This information made me even more determined. I was not just fighting for my cabin. I was fighting against a pattern of exploitation. The restoration work revealed surprises. When we removed damaged siding, we found original builders' marks carved into the frame, dates and initials. We found newspapers from 1947 used as insulation, readable and intact. We found a time capsule of sorts, a metal box tucked into the wall containing photos, letters, and a note from my great-grandfather. "To whoever finds this," the note read, "we built this cabin to last, with honest work and true materials. May it shelter generations of our family, and may they remember where they came from." I sat on the porch that evening, holding that note, and cried. This was not just about property or money. This was about family legacy, about honoring the people who came before. Patricia called with an update. "The State Preservation Office fast-tracked your application. They are sending an evaluator next week. This is very good news, Carter. It means they think you have a legitimate case." What do I need to do? Be there. Have all your documentation ready. Give them full access to the property. And Carter, do not let Sharon Whitmore interfere. She has been calling the Preservation Office trying to discredit your application. On what grounds? She claims the cabin has been so modified over the years that it has lost historic integrity. She is arguing that your current restoration is actually destroying evidence of its original state. That is insane. We are restoring it to its original state. I know. Just be prepared for her to show up and cause problems. The evaluator, Dr. Robert Morrison, arrived on a Thursday morning in late April. He was a serious man in his 50s, with a beard and wire-rimmed glasses, carrying a camera and a thick folder of notes. I gave him the grand tour, showing him every detail, explaining the restoration process and sharing all the documentation. He spent 3 hours examining the cabin, taking measurements, comparing photos from different eras, asking detailed questions about materials and methods. Tom joined us, providing expert commentary on the construction techniques. We were in the loft, Dr. Morrison photographing the original beamwork when Sharon arrived. Dr. Morrison, I am so glad I caught you. I am Sharon Whitmore, president of the Pine Ridge HOA, and I need to inform you of serious concerns about this application. Dr. Morrison turned slowly, his expression neutral. Mrs. Whitmore, I received your letters. Then you know that this property has been significantly altered. What Mr. Kellerman is calling restoration is actually reconstruction. The historic fabric has been compromised. Mrs. Whitmore, I have been evaluating historic properties for 23 years. I know the difference between restoration and reconstruction. What I am seeing here is careful, documented repair work using period-appropriate materials and methods. The integrity of the structure is intact. But the HOA has standards that must be maintained. This property is a safety hazard. That is not my purview. I am here to evaluate historic significance, nothing more. Now, if you will excuse me, I need to complete my assessment. Sharon's face flushed red. This is not over. The HOA has rights. So does Mr. Kellerman. Good day, Mrs. Whitmore. After she left, Dr. Morrison turned to me. She has been quite persistent. 3 phone calls, 5 emails, and now this visit. She really wants this property gone. She wants all the old properties gone, more room for development. He made a note in his folder. Well, for what it is worth, this is one of the finest examples of post-war mountain vernacular architecture I have seen in this region. The craftsmanship is exceptional, and your restoration work is exemplary. I will be recommending approval for state register listing. I could have hugged him. Thank you so much. Do not thank me yet. The recommendation goes to the review board and they make the final decision. That takes time. But based on what I have seen, you have a strong case. 2 weeks later, Patricia called with news. The review board fast-tracked your application. You are on the agenda for their meeting on May 18th. That is 2 days before the HOA hearing. Will we have a decision by then? If things go well, yes. I am going to request that the HOA hearing be postponed pending the board's decision. If the cabin gets designated, the whole condemnation case falls apart. And if the board says no, then we fight at the hearing. But Carter, I have reviewed Dr. Morrison's report. It is glowing. He documented everything, verified all your claims, and explicitly noted that the HOA's complaints are aesthetic, not structural. We are in good shape. The May 18th board meeting was held in Denver, in a state office building downtown. I wore a suit, brought all my documentation, and prepared to make the case of my life. Patricia coached me beforehand. Be factual, be passionate but not emotional. Focus on the history, the craftsmanship, the cultural significance. Do not mention the HOA unless asked. The review board consisted of 5 members, historians and architects who specialized in preservation. They had already read Dr. Morrison's report and my application. Now they wanted to hear directly from me. I told them everything. about my great-grandfather returning from World War II and building a refuge in the mountains, about the cabin being one of the first permanent structures in Pine Ridge, about 3 generations of my family maintaining it, documenting it, living in it, about the craftsmanship and materials that represented a vanishing tradition, about what it would mean to lose this connection to the past. "Mr. Kellerman," one board member said, "we have reviewed the record extensively. This is clearly a significant property. However, we have also received communication from the local HOA expressing concerns about the condition and your restoration work. Can you address that? The HOA wants to condemn the cabin for purely aesthetic reasons. They believe old properties hurt their property values. But the cabin was there first. It is part of the area's foundation. As for the restoration, I have used only period-appropriate materials and traditional methods. We have not altered the structure. We have honored it." Another board member spoke. "I have driven by this property. The location is remarkable, and the cabin fits the landscape in a way modern construction does not. I believe this is exactly the kind of property our preservation laws are meant to protect." They deliberated for 30 minutes while I sat outside, my stomach in knots. Patricia tried to distract me with small talk, but I could barely focus. Finally, they called us back in. "Mr. Kellerman, the board has voted unanimously to approve your application. Effective immediately, the Kellerman cabin is listed on the Colorado State Register of Historic Places." "Congratulations." I actually felt my knees go weak. Patricia grabbed my arm, grinning. "We did it." The board chair continued. "This designation provides your property with significant protections under state law. Any proposed demolition or substantial alteration must now go through a review process that considers historic impact. Local ordinances that conflict with preservation goals can be challenged. You have a powerful tool now, Mr. Kellerman. Use it wisely." We left the building in triumph. Patricia immediately drafted a motion to dismiss the HOA condemnation proceedings, citing the new historic designation and requesting attorney's fees for what she termed frivolous and harassing legal action. The HOA hearing was still scheduled for May 20th, but now it was a formality. Patricia and I showed up with our documentation, ready for battle. Sharon Whitmore sat at the front table with the HOA board and a lawyer who looked like he was already regretting taking this case. The hearing officer, a retired judge named Harold Brennan, reviewed the materials and looked distinctly unimpressed with the HOA's position. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have here a motion to dismiss based on historic designation. Your association is attempting to condemn a property that the state of Colorado has deemed worthy of preservation. Explain to me how that is possible." Sharon stood up, her voice tight. "Your Honor, the HOA has legitimate concerns about property standards and neighborhood aesthetics. This cabin violates multiple covenants that postdate the property's existence. Did Mr. Kellerman's grandfather ever sign your covenants? He refused to participate in the HOA. That is not an answer. Did he sign?" Sharon's lawyer whispered something to her. She sat down. "No." "Then on what legal basis are you attempting to enforce your rules against his property?" "State law requires all properties within HOA boundaries to comply." Patricia stood. "Your Honor, may I address that? Colorado law does allow mandatory HOA inclusion within designated boundaries, but it specifically exempts properties that predate the HOA formation and whose owners never agreed to join. Furthermore, state preservation law takes precedence over local covenants when there is a conflict." "The Kellerman cabin is now protected." Judge Brennan nodded. "I have read the Preservation Board's decision. It is thorough and well-reasoned. Mrs. Whitmore, unless you have evidence of actual safety hazards, not aesthetic complaints, this hearing is over. The property lowers our home values. That is not a legal basis for condemnation. Motion to dismiss is granted. Furthermore, I am sanctioning the HOA for bringing frivolous proceedings. You will pay Mr. Kellerman's attorney's fees. We are adjourned. I wanted to cheer. Sharon looked like she had been slapped. Her lawyer packed his briefcase quickly, clearly eager to escape. As we left the building, Sharon followed us into the parking lot. "This is not over," she hissed. "I will find a way to get rid of that eyesore." "Mrs. Whitmore, that sounds like a threat," Patricia said calmly. "My client's property is protected by state law. Any further harassment will result in legal action against you personally and the HOA as an organization. I suggest you drop this vendetta." We drove back to Pine Ridge in high spirits. Tom had continued the restoration work in my absence, and the cabin looked better than I had ever seen it. The new cedar shake roof gleamed. The siding had been repaired and treated, bringing out the natural beauty of the aged wood. The stonework on the chimney had been repointed. The porch railings, rebuilt to match the originals, were sturdy and level. "It is beautiful," I said. "It is right," Tom replied. "This is how it should have looked all along. Your great-grandfather would be proud." I spent the next few weeks finishing the interior work, refinishing the original pine floors, careful not to sand away too much of the patina that told the story of decades of use, repairing the stone fireplace, using mortar that matched the original composition, updating the electrical and plumbing to modern safety standards, while hiding all the work behind period-appropriate fixtures and covers. The cabin became a labor of love. Every evening, I would sit on the porch with a beer, watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold, feeling connected to something larger than myself. In late June, the State Preservation Office contacted me about a feature article. They wanted to spotlight the cabin as a success story, an example of how historic designation could save important properties. A photographer came out, capturing the cabin in golden afternoon light. A writer interviewed me about the process, the fight with the HOA, the importance of preservation. The article ran in Colorado Heritage Magazine in August. Saving the Kellerman Cabin, one man's fight to preserve his family's legacy, was a 5-page spread with beautiful photos and a detailed account of everything that had happened. It concluded with a call to action about protecting historic properties from overzealous development. The response was overwhelming. I received letters from other property owners fighting their own HOA battles. Historic preservation groups reached out, wanting to use my story as an example. Tourism organizations asked if I would open the cabin for occasional public tours. The mayor of Pine Ridge called to congratulate me and ask if I would speak at a town council meeting about historic preservation in the community. Sharon Whitmore, I heard through the grapevine, had become a pariah. Several HOA members had resigned in protest of how she handled the situation. There was talk of a vote to remove her as president. Property owners who had felt bullied by her were speaking up, comparing notes, realizing they were not alone. In September, things took a dramatic turn. Tom called me late one evening, his voice urgent. "Carter, you need to get up here. Someone tried to break into the cabin." I made the drive from Denver in record time, arriving to find sheriff's deputies walking the property with flashlights. Tom met me by the front porch. "I drove by around 9 and saw a vehicle parked on your access road, no lights. I called it in. By the time deputies arrived, they had fled, but they left this." He handed me a crowbar and a can of gasoline. My blood ran cold. They were going to burn it. "Looks that way." Deputies are dusting for prints, checking tire tracks. This is arson, Carter. Attempted arson anyway. A deputy came over, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression. Mr. Kellerman, I am Deputy Sarah Martinez. Can you think of anyone who might want to harm this property? I hesitated. The HOA president, Sharon Whitmore, has been trying to get this cabin condemned for months. She lost at a hearing and had to pay my legal fees. She threatened me in a parking lot, said it was not over. That is quite an accusation. It is all documented. My lawyer has records of everything. Deputy Martinez made notes. We will follow up. Do you have security cameras on the property? No, but I am installing them immediately. Good idea. We will patrol this area more frequently. If you see anything suspicious, call 911 right away. After the deputies left, Tom and I sat on the porch, both of us shaken. This is crazy, I said. Who burns down a house over HOA rules? Someone who sees their power slipping away. Sharon has built her whole identity around controlling this neighborhood. You beat her publicly. Some people cannot handle that. I called Patricia first thing the next morning, explaining what happened. She was furious. That crosses so many lines. I am filing for a restraining order against Sharon immediately, and I am contacting the district attorney. If she is behind this, it is criminal. We do not have proof it was her. Not yet. But attempted arson is serious. The sheriff will investigate thoroughly. The investigation moved quickly. The tire tracks matched a vehicle registered to Sharon's husband. More damning, security footage from a neighbor's camera, aimed at their own driveway but with a view of the road, showed Sharon's Lexus driving toward my property around 8:45 that night. A hardware store receipt placed her at a store 2 towns over earlier that day, buying gasoline and a crowbar. When deputies arrested Sharon, she tried to deny everything, then claimed she was just checking on the property, concerned about fire hazards from my restoration work. The gasoline was for her lawn mower. The crowbar was in case she needed to open a window to check for gas leaks. Nobody bought it. The district attorney charged her with attempted arson, trespassing, and criminal mischief. The HOA immediately suspended her and issued a statement condemning her actions. Her lawyer, in a preliminary hearing, tried to paint her as mentally unwell, stressed by the responsibility of HOA management. She became fixated on this property, he argued. In her mind, she was protecting the neighborhood, preventing danger. She needs treatment, not prison. The judge was unsympathetic. Mrs. Whitmore attempted to burn down a state-registered historic property because she lost a legal dispute. That is not mental illness. That is criminal behavior. Bail is set at $50,000. The trial was scheduled for November. Patricia represented me at the proceedings, ensuring my victim impact statement was on record. I described the emotional toll, the fear of losing my family's legacy, the violation of knowing someone wanted to destroy something I loved. In October, Sharon's lawyer approached Patricia about a plea deal. Sharon would plead guilty to attempted criminal mischief and trespassing in exchange for dropping the arson charge. She would serve 6 months in jail, pay restitution for security systems and increased insurance costs, and resign permanently from the HOA board. Patricia called me with the offer. It is your call, Carter. We can push for trial, potentially get the arson conviction. But trials are unpredictable, and this guarantees she serves time and stays away from you. Does it include a permanent restraining order? Yes. She cannot come within 500 feet of you or your property. Ever? Then I accept. I just want this over. Sharon pled guilty in late October. At the sentencing hearing, I was there to read my victim impact statement in person. Sharon Whitmore tried to burn down my family's cabin because she could not control me through bureaucracy. I said, looking directly at her. She saw this historic property as an obstacle to her vision of what the neighborhood should be. When legal means failed, she turned to criminal means. She is not a victim. She is not misunderstood. She is someone who valued her own preferences over the law, over safety, over my family's heritage. I hope her time in jail teaches her that power does not mean you can destroy what you dislike. Sharon stared at her hands, never meeting my eyes. The judge sentenced her to 6 months, which she would serve at the county facility. Her husband, who had been quietly supportive throughout the ordeal, filed for divorce 2 weeks later. With Sharon gone, the Pine Ridge HOA underwent significant reforms. New leadership took over, people who actually cared about the community rather than just property values. They reached out to me, apologizing for what had happened and asking if I wanted to participate in developing new guidelines that respected both historic properties and reasonable neighborhood standards. I agreed, on one condition, that the HOA adopt formal protections for properties over 50 years old, requiring historic review before any condemnation proceedings. They accepted immediately. By December, the cabin restoration was complete. I had spent nearly $40,000, exhausted my savings, and worked myself to exhaustion, but it was worth it. The cabin gleamed, a perfect preservation of mid-century mountain architecture. The State Preservation Office sent a bronze plaque that I mounted by the front door. Kellerman Cabin, Colorado State Historic Register, built 1947. On Christmas Eve, I held a small gathering at the cabin. Marcus came, Tom and his wife, Dorothy from the Historical Society, Patricia, some of the neighbors who had supported me. We drank hot cider and told stories by the fireplace, the same fireplace my great-grandfather had built with stones from the creek. "I never told you what finally made me decide to fight," I said to the group. "It was a note my great-grandfather left in the wall, a time capsule. He wrote that the cabin was built to last, with honest work and true materials. He wanted generations of our family to shelter here." When I read that, I knew I could not let Sharon or anyone else erase that legacy. "You did not just save a building," Dorothy said. "You saved a piece of our collective history. There are so few places left that tell the story of how this area was really built, by real people doing real work. Thank you for fighting." In January, I made a decision. I could not keep commuting between Denver and Pine Ridge, could not keep treating the cabin as a weekend retreat. This place was too important. I gave notice at my job, packed up my Denver apartment, and moved to the cabin full-time. I transitioned to freelance graphic design, which I could do from anywhere with internet. The cabin became my office, my home, my sanctuary. I woke each morning to the sound of the creek, spent my afternoons working at a desk by the window with a view of the mountains, and my evenings maintaining the property just as my grandfather had done. The story did not end there. In February, the Colorado Historical Society reached out about creating a documentary on preservation efforts across the state. The Kellerman cabin would be featured as a centerpiece, an example of successful grassroots preservation. A film crew spent 3 days at the property, interviewing me, capturing the details of the restoration, telling the story of the fight against the HOA. The documentary aired on Colorado Public Television in April, exactly 1 year after that first threatening letter had arrived. It was titled Standing Ground, Preserving Colorado's Heritage, and the segment about the cabin was powerful. They included interviews with Dr. Morrison, Patricia, Tom, and even some members of the reformed Pine Ridge HOA. The message was clear. Historic preservation was not about stopping progress. It was about honoring the past while building the future. After the documentary aired, something unexpected happened. Tourism in Pine Ridge increased. People wanted to see the cabin, to understand what made it worth fighting for. I started offering monthly tours, limited to small groups, explaining the history and the restoration process. The tour fees went into a maintenance fund, ensuring the cabin would be cared for long term. The mayor of Pine Ridge approached me about establishing a historic district that would provide protections for the area's remaining older properties. I worked with the town council and preservation experts to develop guidelines that balanced preservation with property rights. It was not about freezing the town in time. It was about making sure change happened thoughtfully, with respect for what came before. In May, I received a letter from a law firm in California. It was from Sharon's ex-husband, Daniel. He wrote that he had been horrified by Sharon's actions, had no idea about her obsession with the cabin until the arrest. He apologized profusely and offered to contribute to the cabin's preservation fund. He sent a check for $10,000. I debated cashing it, but ultimately decided to accept. The money was not tainted by Sharon's crimes. It was Daniel's attempt to make amends for something that was not really his fault. I used it to establish a formal nonprofit, the Kellerman Cabin Preservation Trust. The mission was to maintain the cabin and use it as an educational resource about mountain architecture, homesteading history, and historic preservation. Marcus, who had been with me since that first frantic phone call, became a board member. So did Dorothy, Tom, and Patricia. We held our first official meeting in the cabin's living room, planning programs and fundraising campaigns. "You know what is amazing?" Marcus said. "A year ago, you were fighting just to keep this place. Now you are building something that will outlast all of us." He was right. The cabin had become more than just my inheritance. It was a teaching tool, a gathering place, a symbol of what could be saved when people cared enough to fight. Sharon was released from jail in April after serving her full 6 months. I heard she moved to Arizona, far from Pine Ridge and the community she had tried to control. I felt no triumph in her downfall, just relief that the threat was over. The restraining order remained in effect, a permanent boundary between her past actions and my future. The Pine Ridge HOA, under new leadership, became a model for reasonable community governance. They established clear procedures for dispute resolution, protections for historic properties, and transparency in decision-making. Other HOAs in Colorado reached out, asking how they had transformed from a bullying organization to a collaborative one. The answer was simple. They started listening instead of dictating. In June, I met someone. Her name was Bridget Zimmerman, and she was a photographer for Colorado Heritage magazine, assigned to do a follow-up feature on the cabin. She arrived on a bright morning with professional cameras and an easy smile. We talked for hours, not just about the cabin but about art, history, family, what mattered in life. "This place has such soul," she said, photographing the way light fell through the window onto the old pine floors. "You can feel the generations that lived here." That is exactly what I was trying to preserve, not just a structure but a feeling, a connection. She turned her camera on me, catching me off guard. "That is the shot, the man who saved his heritage." We started dating slowly and carefully. Bridget lived in Boulder but came up to Pine Ridge most weekends. She loved the cabin, understood why it mattered, and brought her own perspective as someone who documented disappearing places for a living. "So many places like this are being lost," she told me one evening as we sat on the porch. Strip malls replacing family farms, McMansions replacing historic neighborhoods. What you did here, fighting back, winning, it gives people hope. By summer's end, Bridget had moved into the cabin. We turned the loft into a shared workspace, her photography equipment on one side, my design setup on the other. We took walks by the creek, hosted dinners for friends, and planned a future that honored the past. In September, the State Preservation Office announced their annual awards. The Kellerman Cabin Preservation Trust received the Governor's Award for Historic Preservation, recognizing our efforts to save and maintain a significant property. The ceremony was in Denver, and I wore the same suit I had worn to the review board hearing 18 months earlier. The governor himself presented the award, a crystal plaque engraved with the cabin's image. "This is what preservation looks like," he said to the audience. "Not committees in distant capitals, but individuals who care enough to fight for what matters." Carter Kellerman faced bureaucratic obstacles, legal challenges, and even criminal threats. He prevailed because he understood that some things are worth saving, even when the world tells you to give up. Colorado is richer for his efforts. I accepted the award with Bridget beside me, thinking about my great-grandfather's note in the wall. "Built to last, with honest work and true materials." That was what I had tried to do in my own way. Not just restore a building, but honor a legacy. The cabin today stands as it has for over 75 years, a testament to craftsmanship and resilience. Tour groups visit monthly, learning about post-war construction techniques and the importance of historic preservation. School groups come to understand how their community developed. Families like mine, with their own stories of homesteading and building, find connection and inspiration. I still work there every day, my laptop on the same table where my grandfather ate breakfast for 50 years. The creek still runs through the property, cool and clear. The mountains still frame the view. The cabin still stands exactly as it should. Sharon's attempt to condemn it feels like ancient history now, though barely 2 years have passed. The lesson I learned through that ordeal was simple but profound. Institutions and bureaucracies have power, but they do not have inevitability. When something is worth saving, when you are willing to stand and fight with truth and determination, you can win against seemingly impossible odds. The HOA that tried to destroy my family's cabin no longer exists in any meaningful sense. It was reformed so completely that it bears no resemblance to the organization Sharon ran. Meanwhile, the cabin she despised is now protected by state law, celebrated in documentaries and magazine features, and visited by people who understand that history is not just dates in textbooks. It is places and structures, built by human hands, that connect us to who we were and who we can be. I think about that sometimes, sitting on the porch in the evening. My great-grandfather built this cabin with his own hands after surviving a war. My grandfather maintained it through decades of change and challenge. I fought to preserve it when forces of greed and small-mindedness tried to erase it. And someday, I will pass it to the next generation, along with all the stories and lessons it contains. That is what winning looks like. Not just keeping a piece of property, but ensuring that the values it represents, the craftsmanship, the connection to place, the respect for what came before, those things endure. Sharon Whitmore tried to condemn my inherited cabin. Instead, I restored it to historic landmark status, and in doing so, restored something in myself. A sense of purpose, a connection to my roots, an understanding that the past and future are not enemies but partners in creating meaning. The cabin stands. The story continues. And I am exactly where I am supposed to be, guardian of a legacy that will outlast all of us, built with honest work and true materials, sheltering generations just as it was meant to do.